Okay, good. So welcome back, and I'm delighted to open our second session today, which will focus on issues of representation of victimary. Our first speaker, Professor Roman Katsman, from the Department of Literature of the Jewish People in Bar-Ilan University, has authored 3 books on Russian and Israeli literature and 6 books on Hebrew literature, including the philosophical anthropological studies in Etgar Keret stories, to whom today's presentation is dedicated. His paper titled Overcoming the Victimary and Postmemorial Paradigm in Etgar Keret's Holocaust Stories. Roman, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michal. All right. So in this short presentation, I will try to summarize as far as possible the cultural, anthropological, and poetic attitudes in Etgar Keret's stories dedicated to the Holocaust and the memory of it. The famous Hebrew author of short stories, born in 1967 in Ramat Gan, has not written many such texts, but they all became very popular and some were included in the school curriculum. Few of them are included in collections of Keret's stories, from Pipes, Tzinurot in 1992 to Breakdown at the Edge of the Galaxy, Takala b'Ktzei Galaxia. The English title is Fly Already in 2018. Basically, we are talking about the stories Siren, Snickers, the sad story of the Nemalim family. I and Ludwig are killing Hitler for no reason. Breakdown at the Edge of the Galaxy, Yad Vashem, and Tabula Rasa. In all Keret stories related to the Shoah, the same pattern of memory transmission is found. First, memory serves the purposes of life in the present, and in this sense, it can be considered evolutionary. Second, due to its function of adaptation and improvement, it necessarily contains creative potential. It is never reduced to the given, experienced, perceived, and in this sense, it can be defined as emergent. The fashionable postmodern concept of post-memory is not applicable to the work of Keret about the Shoah, since Keret blocks both trauma and the past itself, and the life that arises in the present remains in the focus. Therefore, this concept should be replaced by the concept of emergent memory. The irony is that at the level of a declarative political ideology, Keret's gesture belongs to the progressive agenda, but in fact it is purely conservative. This is so because the plot of all these stories is based on the chronotype of a liberated hero, a revolutionary who breaks the ban and breaks his chains. Museums, memorials, state memorable dates, public myths, and taboos act as such chains. That is everything that cannot be touched, and even more so, encroach on its unviolability. On a superficial level, they embody a state of hypocritical bourgeois culture and enslaving state ideology. However, it is enough to remember how these chains arose for Keret's gesture to change its sign to the opposite. All of them were the result, firstly, of the ethical turn in post-war Europe, and secondly, the consequence of deep infusion into the mass consciousness of phenomenological and hermeneutic philosophy, which removes the distinction between idea and reality, meaning and being, that which eventually degenerated into postmodernism. In other words, museization and the cult of the victim were the response of the progressive elite to attempts of dehumanization in the name of high socialist ideals, National Socialist in Germany and Marxist Socialist in Russia. That is a dehumanizing social utopianism in itself replacing being with an idea, was replaced by neo-Marxist with ethical utopianism, which retains the same philosophical core of indistinguishability of being and an idea, and also requires victim and the cult of victim for its implementation. It was from this utopian hermeneutic victimization that the concept of post-memory was subsequently born. Thus, when the heroes of Keret rebel against the museum and the state cult of the victim, they in fact are getting included in the conservative, individualist, and realistic agenda. That is, they are fighting to limit the power of the state, to gain individual freedom, and as the main means of achieving these goals, to distinguish between life and idea, being and consciousness. As the philosophers of speculative realism claim, that is Harman, Meyasu, and others, who are trying to return to thinking the right and the ability to recognize reality and serve the truth, the real always contains more than the signifier, the representation, the phenomenal. This greater is the object, and therefore the attempt to appropriate it is always doomed to failure. The creator of generative anthropology, Erga, writes about the same abortion, seeing the source of meaning, culture, and ethics in the deferral of sacrifice, and not in its implementation, as his teacher and friend René Girard believed. This more, which includes non-sacrifice, is the creative increment of emergent memory. According to the iron logic of reality itself, it serves as the only way to turn memory into life and fulfill its function to facilitate survival, development, and prevention of repetition of the fatal mistakes of the past. Let us now examine in more detail the model of memory in Keret's stories. It has four main components. The first is what can be called a given, an ideology, someone else's speech, a ready-made reality. These are semiotic fossils, Shoah Day, the siren, museums, memorials, laws and customs, commonplaces, education and discipline, artistic and documentary artifacts. In the terms of fairy tales, this is a sleeping beauty, a princess in a crystal coffin, neither alive nor dead. In the terms of myth, the goddess of fertility abducted by the god of the dead. In the terms of anthropology, it is sacred, untouchable, excluded from the cycle of birth and death, from temporality and corporeality. It's muktzeh, untouchable in Hebrew, central but at the same time unknown, unpronounceable, taboo. This also includes the characters of those killed and survivors of the Holocaust. They are not zombies or ghosts, but they are not completely living people. They are included in the ideological discourse, along with the narratives, myth, and with the social stereotypes associated with them, with the psychology attributed to them, and emotional baggage. They do not have an independent individual human existence. They are an object of manipulation, dead signs, like the, quote, grandfather made of cardboard in the story Snickers. Other humanoid creatures are priests and servants of the ideological cult, teachers, their obedient students, representatives of the second generation, jealously guarding their past and their parents. This first and most massive component rests on a foundation of victimization. The discursive configuration arising around the victim prohibits live and inquisitive touch, but obliges to empathy and compassion, which already contains a double contradictory message inherent in totalitarian ideologies. Therefore, it is not surprising that the consequence of this is anger. personal protest, transgression, equated to the sin, betrayal, rebellion, blasphemy, and iconoclasm. This brings us to the second component of the model, the rebel hero. At first glance, he is a revolutionary. This is manifested in the fact that his rebellion begins with a violation of the prohibition imposed by the hypocritical bourgeois society. However, it quickly becomes clear that this is only the outer side of the rebellion, the infantile one, so aptly expressed by the children's characters. The true meaning of the rebellion lies in the self-affirmation of the individual, far from socialism, in the realization of the desire or even the fantasy of the individual, his freedom and uniqueness. I think it was this freedom-loving and humanistic message that was the reason that Keret's stories were included in the school curriculum. At least I hope so. The hero's rebellion has not a social but a personal motive, not an ideological but a pragmatic motive, namely salvation from nothingness, from violence by the forces of collective consciousness, which rule outside the consciousness of the individual and seek to dehumanize him and turn him into a victim. Carried to the point of absurdity, this rebellion leads the hero to assume the role of the executioner as a means of abandoning the role of a victim. This is how, for example, the story Tabula Rasa ends, where a Holocaust survivor shoots a clone of Hitler. However, the author's goal is to criticize this way of thinking and acting. He's trying to lead the reader to understand that the very dichotomy of executioner and victim, or hero and victim, must be dismissed as unrealistic and ineffective when analyzing living, authentic, not imaginary cultural phenomena. By virtue of this, the main act of the hero, which constitutes the core of the chronotope and the third component of the model, is escaping or living. Technically, the materialization of transgression, which alone allows one to survive and sometimes acquire new strengths or even a new essence, that is, to evolve or simply to mature. This is an escape from trauma and victimization, both from our own and from borrowed or implanted, as supposed by the theory of post-memory, from learned helplessness and victimhood. In those cases when the withdrawal fails, as in Tabula Rasa, the model is also reinforced, albeit by contradiction. The transgressive gesture of touching the sacred should lead to the annihilation of the hero, as for example, in the biblical story about the touch of Uzzah to the tabernacle of the covenant, where this gesture was not even intentional. In Keret, the biblical model is reversed in the spirit of the carnival and secular, romantic and theomatic tradition, and the transgressive gesture is carried out as the mythical or magical act of reviving the dead. Both the victims of the Holocaust and the victims of the ideology of museization and post-memory belong to the dead. This provocative equalization of a wide variety of victims also includes well-known comparisons, such as those of the victims of the Holocaust and victims of persecution of Jews in Arab countries, or in another example of people who have lost children, or women who have had an abortion, or children who have had abused by their peers. Such an absurd expansion of victimhood leads to its meaninglessness. The fourth and last component of the model is the transformation, the rebirth of the heroes, the new saved existence and a new emergent memory, which cannot be reduced to the sum of states and events that led to its appearance. The most extreme and absurd embodiment of the idea of such a person is a clone of Hitler, who does not know who he is, in the story Tabula Rasa. Memory includes the acquired knowledge and judgments about the Holocaust, the memory of its museization, commemoration, and ideology, the identity of an individualist rebel against the latter, and the realization of personal desire and freedom, the memory of living this scene of sacrifice and the trauma of dehumanization, as well as something supplemental, which chaotically, almost out of the field of awareness, and even though forgetting, arises from the very thick of the real and unites all the other components into a single synergetic system. This something is best expressed in play and dialogue. Here in the principle of play and principle of dialogue. Here it is not post-memories that dictates the form of the personality, but on the contrary, a new memory arises as a consequence of the formation of a new personality. Freedom of self-expression in play, dialogue, live contact with the science of culture opposes the deadness of the memorial. Holocaust victims rise from the dead not as zombies, but as living participants in the dialogue. As a result, the transformed hero who did not know and did not remember them becomes the authority, voice and consciousness who knows, understands, and establishes a new form of remembering, not only for his own, but also for previous generations. The authority is not the survivor, but the reborn, that is, in mythological terms, the sacred child. In modern religious Jewish philosophy, such knowledge is sometimes called the second naivety, with the difference that in Keret, it, like everything religious and mythological, is carnivally inverted, and instead of expressing the irrational knowledge of faith, it embodies the triumph of rationality within the mythological. Thus, for instance, it is the idea of metempsychosis that leads to a rational perception of reality. The alien turns out to be more pragmatic and understanding than the son of a Holocaust survivor. Naive comparisons of stranger, non-Jew, for example, better capture the essence of dehumanization and thus also the Holocaust itself. In conclusion, I will describe one poetic device used by Keret in the book Breakdown and the Edge of the Galaxy in the story of the same name. It is an epistolary sequel consisting of 6 parts, separated in the book by other stories. It is composed of an email correspondence between Michal Warszawski, note the name Warszawski, the son of a Holocaust survivor, and the owner of the escape room, who in the end reveals as an alien who came to study the customs of Earthlings. Michal manages, with the help of all kinds of psychological manipulation and aggressive demagogy, to persuade the protesting alien, who also took on the image of an Iraqi Jew, to open a room for them on Shoah Day, even though this is not quite acceptable. The story ends with a disappointed alien abandoning attempts to establish contact with humanity and flying away from Earth, destroying all traces of his presence here. The most interesting thing in this story is that it is printed on pages in the book that are not reflected in any way in the table of contents of the book. That is, they seem to be absent in the archive, in the database, in memory. And this despite the fact that in the reality, the story occupies a significant place in the book, and moreover, gives the title to the entire collection. This symbolically denotes repression and displacement, erasure of the archive, that is post-trauma, which however does not lead to the emergence of a substitute signifier simulacrum in consciousness, that is in the table of contents. That is, does not lead to the emergence of post-memory. Traces of the past, scenes of struggle, conflict, violence are not erased, contrary to the instructions of an extremely disciplined and politically correct alien. On the contrary, they remain firmly rooted in the living fabric of reality that is in the book, but they cease to be recognized by archiving, classifying, codifying consciousness. Consequently, in order to reproduce them in memory, it is necessary to experience, to read them again in reality, and not in the catalog of consciousness, that is in table of contents. That is, they must be created in you, which I call emergent memory. The secret of emergent, perhaps it would also be correct to call it realistic memory, is that two opposing processes are required for its emergence. And this is precisely the essence of the synergetic system. On the one hand, the process of transformation of a personality into a sign. And on the other hand, the process of transformation of a sign into a personality. The first can be called, after Eric Ganz's, generative anthropological, and the second may be called mythopoetic. If we define the myth in terms of Alexei Losev as a miraculous personal story given in words. Emmanuel Levinas, whose philosophy also grew out of the Holocaust experience, calls these two opposites totality and infinity, or ethics. Keret, in his stories of the Holocaust, seems to be begging an imaginary dispute with Levinas, showing that these two processes feed each other and are impossible one without the other. Such thinking in a synergetic paradigm saves from the trap of the dichotomy of victim and executioner, and at the same time avoids the mistake that Giorgio Agamben made when he derived his concept of indistinguishability between victim and executioner from Primo Levi's idea of the Holocaust gray zone. In Keret, the victim and the executioner are clearly distinguished. However, this distinction is derived from the center of meaning formation and being compromised, not because there is gray zone between these concepts, no, but because by and of themselves they lack rationally critical and realistic analytical validity. Instead, the distinction between sign-generating and person-generating processes becomes essential for the writer. This tension between them constitutes the driving force of cultural reality, and not the process of victimary self-identification. This is also what constitutes the new form of memory and commemoration, leaving aside the question of how strong and persuasive this philosophy is. I just want to note in conclusion that it leads Keret to creative solutions that make him one of the most interesting and original Israeli writers of the Holocaust. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roman, for this bright lecture and bringing in philosophical anthropological perspectives. Question we'll take after, and we'll move on to our second speaker in this session. Bettine, I hope I pronounce the name as it should be, Siertsema, is an assistant professor in history at Vrije Universiteit, Amsterdam. She published a collection of essays on Dutch Holocaust literature, and last week she sent her text to the Palgrave Publishing House. This book deals with the rescue of a group of Jewish children in Bergen-Belsen based on their oral testimonies. She will speak, or you will speak today, on Blurring the Lines, 3 novels on the shades of gray between victim and perpetrator. Please.
Yes. I changed my title a bit. It's on 4 novels, and can you see this? My PowerPoint or not?
Not yet.
Oh. How do I do that then? Oh, share screen.
Press the green button.
Yes.
Share screen, and then choose the PowerPoint. Exactly.
Exactly. Okay. So this is not, well, it's okay. I don't
now,
will not try to amend it more.
Just put your presentation on full screen so we can see it fully. It's
slideshow.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
That's it.
Right. Blurring the lines has become blurry. The blurry lines, and perpetrator and victim are good and evil now. So I'd like to discuss 4 novels, comparing them with respect to the dimension of guilt and good and evil, but from a national perspective. The categories that Raoul Hilberg defined are helpful here: perpetrators, bystanders, victims, to which I add the category of helpers. And perpetrators are between inverted commas, because in these novels, the real perpetrators, the Nazis, are mostly just in the background. They are not focused on. So perpetrators are, well, that will become clear in my presentation. The novels are a Dutch and the Polish one, and 2 from Israel. And I try to link this trope of the many shades of guilt to the nationality of the novel. And what I present today is more a handful of observations than a full-fledged paper yet. These are the novels I want to discuss. One of them is The Memory Monster. It already was discussed in the last presentation, and it is on the reading list of this webinar, so I assume you have read it. If not, well, that's a pity. And at least I will refrain from sketching the plot. But I introduce briefly the other Israeli one, which is not on the reading list, and the Polish and Dutch novels too, in case you haven't read them for the previous webinars or have forgotten them by now, which is quite understandable. The Israeli novel I want to discuss first is Emunah Elon's House on Endless Waters, which is set in Amsterdam. It is about an Israeli writer, Yoel Bloom, who is on a promotion tour in the Netherlands. In the Jewish Museum in Amsterdam, he comes across a photograph in which he recognizes his mother and sister, but the baby his mother is holding is definitely not him. After having returned to Israel and learning from his sister the truth of that photo, but the reader does not learn that along with him, he decides to write a novel about that story, that history, and returns to Amsterdam. Wandering around the city, he identifies more and more with Sonja, his mother, and past and present blend more or less as we, as readers, witness his writing process. It presents a very credible picture of the way the Nazi net is tightening around Jewish Dutch citizens, how they are trapped with ever diminishing chances of escape. The event around which the main plot evolves is how Sonja, his mother, ends up in transit camp Westerbork with her daughter after having found a good hiding address for her baby son. Her wealthy upstairs neighbors, the Rousseau family, have a son of the same age as hers. The father of that family holds a position in the Jewish council. When Sonja and her children qualify for the so-called exchange transport to Palestine via Bergen-Belsen, he manages, so the neighbor, the former neighbor, he manages to cause a delay of the arrival of her son Leo in Westerbork, and he urges Sonja to take his own son instead of him, so as not to leave the privileged place unused. She concurs. In the end, Sonja, her daughter, and her alleged son, whom she calls Joel, survive, and she makes sure Joel will never discover his real descent. The Russo family is deported to Auschwitz, where they perish with little Leo, who now passes as their son. The position of Martin Russo at a Jewish council didn't carry enough weight to prevent that, as he had already anticipated. In this novel, the positive image of the Dutch attitude during the German occupation is debunked, as happens, by the way, in much Dutch adult literature about the war. This positive image, which has been also to a great extent the national self-image, is probably caused by the Anne Frank story, in which aid givers like Mipris play such a courageous and compassionate role. One of the scenes in a novel by Elon that has stayed with me for the most is how the neighborhood's mothers send Sonja and her children away from a nearby playground because it is forbidden for Jews. So the exclusion in fact, so to say. Indifference, looking the other way, cowardice. That is how the attitude of most non-Jewish Dutch can be summarized, apart from a very small, but at least a small minority of people who betrayed Jewish fellow citizens. But this criticism is only invoked by the setting of the novel. And for an Israeli writer about a Dutch background, without a Dutch background, it is obviously no self-criticism. The main storyline, however, contains some significant Jewish self-criticism. Martin Russo, Joel's real father, probably has actively ensured that Sonja's son Leo would not reach Westerbork in time to be able to pressure Sonja to agree with his plan to take his son to relatively safe Bergen-Belsen. In a way, this is the climax of the lack of solidarity shown by the wealthy Russo family towards Sonja, who is struggling with social isolation and a lack of financial means. The guilt of Martin Russo is the guilt of a victim who will do anything to save his child, even if another child has to be sacrificed to achieve that. The author latches on to the ever ongoing debate on the Jewish Council, which often, at least in the Netherlands, points to the attitude of saving themselves and their own kind while letting the masses from the working class go without apparent qualms. Emunah Elon's novel shares the Dutch setting with Jessica Durlacher's book, The Daughter. Much more importantly, they are similar in one important plot element, mistaken identity, purposefully brought about during the war. Contrary to the Israeli novel, in the Dutch novel, it is a perpetrator who is responsible for this switching of identities. Now, my mistake was that I thought that Jessica Durlacher's novel was on the reading list for the first webinar. But I saw, and maybe some of you have read it, but I saw that it has not been translated into English. It is in Russian and in Bulgarian and in Italian, and in German, as you can see, but it's not in Hebrew and not in English. So I'll have to be a bit more explicit about the plot than I meant to be. This is a brief summary of it. The male protagonist, the first person narrator, is son of a survivor, Max Lipschitz. He falls in love with Sabine Edelstein, who works as a volunteer at the Anne Frank House. So there we have the institution. Unlike Max, she immerses herself in the history of the Holocaust and can't stop talking about it. Her father had been in hiding with a farmer's family, was betrayed by the farmer's son, who was in love with the same Jewish girl as Sabine's father, also in hiding at the farm. Though Max and Sabine are very much in love, Sabine one day disappears without any explanation, just the explicit order for Max not to go and look for her. Though he does not completely comply, he does not find her. At an international book fair 15 years later, they meet again, he as a publisher, she as a photographer, and they pick up their relationship. She is the assistant of an American film producer of Dutch origin, Sam, whose memoirs Max will publish. Again, one day, Sabine disappears without a word. Max reads the producer's book to be and recognizes his story, only with the producer in the role of the betrayed young man. This will be no surprise to you now. Sabine's father turns out to be the treacherous farmer's son, who had taken on a Jewish identity to hide his misdeeds. So clearly, in the end, there is no blurring of the line between good and evil here. Sabine's father is unequivocally representing evil here. And if it stems from jealousy in a love competition, or the enjoyment of his power, or a basic feeling of inferiority towards the intellectually gifted Jews in hiding, that is not relevant for the degree of guilt. The switching of identities between perpetrator and victim is, of course, in the tradition of von Hilsenrath's novel, The Nazi and the Barber, and Robert Shaw's The Man in the Glass Booth. New is the second generation setting of this theme. It remains unclear if and when Sabine guessed about her father's deception. There's a tiny subplot, a minor subplot in this novel, and that's about Max's aunt Judy, who is the reason that he visits the Anne Frank house, because he wouldn't have gone there by himself, but she wants to. And Judy, so his father's sister, got him back when he was visiting his neighbors at the moment that the family's home was raided by the Nazis to get the family arrested. So his sister wanted the family to be together, and she got Max's father from the neighbors. So more or less condemning him to a concentration camp experience. But in that concentration camp, she was vital for his survival by her energetic efforts to keep them alive. So that is a subplot. Both the daughter, this novel, and The Rat Laughed are unambiguously about the guilt of helpers. Stefan, in the Israeli novel, is definitely evil, an anti-Semitic scoundrel driven by lust and opportunism, and he gets away with it. It is precisely because the lack of gray tones that he is not very interesting as a character, I think. The villain in The Daughter, the son of the family that gives a number of Jews shelter, is more complex. Yet, And the Rat Laughed is as a whole a much more complex and challenging book than the Dutch novel, which is basically straightforward detective-like plot, of which the unraveling is not really very credible, with a lot of chance meetings and the like. But I leave And Rat Laughed aside for now because it will be discussed tonight, I think, or later today. Of the four novels, The Memory Monster has the clearest national angle. One of the underlying questions is, how should Israel deal with the memory of the Holocaust in education? It is self-critical in many ways. The first-person narrator keeps himself, at least initially, at an emotional distance from his subject. And that is, I think, recognizable for many Holocaust scholars in the long run, at least from time to time, because you have to cope emotionally, you keep your distance. He recognizes the superficiality of the sentiment of the high school students he shows around at the Polish sites of the extermination camps. He begins to exceed the limit of his job when he confronts the groups with questions like, what would you do if, for instance, what would you do if very far from where you are, your army would exterminate people whom you think of as your mortal enemy? When his young son is bullied in kindergarten, he behaves like a powerful father, threatening and violent father, threatening the classmates, which confronts him with his existential questions about defenselessness and the willingness and ability to use violence, even vehement violence if necessary. This resonates, I think, with the episode about the Israeli military who devised a liberation of one of the campsites to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Wannsee Conference. And also perhaps the computer game that is designed with his help and which enables the player to identify with camp guards, for instance, or SS officers. The first-person narrator eventually becomes imbued with the view that you cannot live if you are not prepared to use violence, even deathly violence if necessary. It is this realization and its consequences that gives him a nervous breakdown, or is it, that's the question, is it this realization or the constant confrontation with the Nazi crimes of the past? And that latter view is what most Israeli reviewers contend, but I myself have doubts. The narrator addresses the Yad Vashem director as the one who has put him in that position of the tour guide, and also helps him with his work as an historian in his PhD work. So he makes him, as it were, co-responsible for, well, his history and in the end, his nervous breakdown, I think. Then the fourth, this was the plot, but you know the plot, so this was an unnecessary slide. And then the fourth novel is the Polish one by Agata Tuszyńska about Vera Graham. Oh, I did not write a plot line here. At least not on the slide. The novel tells how a female writer makes contact with the former singer Vera Graham in order to write her biography. The book is neither a novel nor a biography, but more an account of the investigations and conversations that should have led to the biography. Vera Graham was a very popular Warsaw singer before the war and continued to be so when the ghetto was created. After the war, she was accused of collaboration because she was once seen with a member of the Jewish Gestapo who engaged her to sing one evening at an SS party outside the ghetto. She was acquitted from the accusations of collaboration multiple times, but it still clung to her and ruined her further career and her personal life, and probably even her sanity. On her turn, she accused the man who used to accompany her on the piano, Władysław Szpilman, the protagonist, by the way, of Roman Polanski's film, of whom in the Jewish, she accused him of being in the Jewish Gestapo and having dragged a woman by her hair to a selection. The accusation was apparently motivated by his refusal to help her getting back on stage after the war. But there is no evidence whatsoever that her memory, if there was a memory, was correct. In this book, the evil focused on lies in the post-war period. The evil of the Nazi occupation and extermination of the Jews is, of course, not contested, but it is not a topic as such. Vera Graham represents, as it were, Polish Jewish self-criticism. It shows that survivors were overly eager to find fault with the wartime behavior of fellow Jews in order to exonerate or gloss over their own behavior, perhaps. Because almost any survivor in Poland, sooner or later, will have had to dirty their hands. That is the underlying argument, I think. So in a sense, the evil that is denounced here is the lack of empathy and understanding in the Polish Jewish community, or what was left of it after the war. Vera Graham, as a person, fell victim to it, but in her turn tries to retaliate by incriminating the pianist Szpilman with even less evidence. So, summarizing and using Hilberg for that, The House on Endless Waters criticizes Dutch bystanders and Dutch Jewish victims. In the daughter, the situation focuses on Dutch helpers, but helpers between inverted commas in this case. The daughter tackles the figure of the helper, but without suggesting any general applicability. The memory monster, the red left, of course, is it's Polish helpers. Well, helper is quite a wrong term in this case. And the Polish bystanders, you remember the villagers and how the priests in the last section of the novel looks at them and sees how anti-Semitic they are, for instance. And perhaps in the science fiction part of the novel, also the offspring of the victims. That's questionable. In the memory monster, national self-criticism is shown from the perspective of the former victims. And in Vera Graham, it's, as I said, the Polish Jewish victims in a post-war situation, the relentless attitude of former victims towards each other. So I am very eager to know what the next seminar will bring us in when German literature will come into the picture. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very rich presentation. And we'll quickly move to our final speaker. Dr. Nina Rosenberg is an art historian specializing in the art and legacy of the Holocaust, focusing on women artists, oeuvre, and graphic novels during and after World War II, as well as the Holocaust in European memorials and in films. She lectures on those subjects at the Technion, Haifa. Dr. Rosenberg was the art curator at the Ghetto Fighters House Museum in Israel and is the art editor of PRISM, Journal for Holocaust Educators, Yeshiva University in New York. Her talk today, Confronting the Holocaust in 21st Century Israeli Graphic Novels. Pnina, the floor is yours.
Pnina, צריכה לעשות unmute.
Can you see it? Can you see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay. So,
Nina, just maybe set the presentation for full screen.
it is, isn't it?
No, yes.
Yes, it is.
So press it now.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. So I've changed a bit the title of my presentation, and it will deal with two confessional graphic novels done by a second-generation artist, Israeli artist, Michal Kishka and Michal Kovner. Michal Kishka did The Things I Didn't Tell My Father, published following the French version that was published in 2012. It was published in the Hebrew, was done in 2013. Michal Kovner published his Ezekiel's World, a graphic novel, in 2015. And he wrote it in English, though it was published in Israel. So both graphic novels are dealing with each protagonist deals with his real father or semi-real in Kovner's case. And let's start with, before starting, I would like to say a few words about the topic of a second generation. The perception of Holocaust survivors' offspring as second generation first appeared in 1977 in Helen Epstein's article, Heirs of the Holocaust, that was published in New York Times Sunday Magazine and followed by her book, Children of the Holocaust, Conversation with Sons and Daughters of Survivors, published 2 years later. The designation that refers, among others, to the shared experience in the everyday life of those who grew up with survivor parents, experience that were also the topics of graphic novels from Spiegelman Maus on. Michal Kishka was the first Israeli artist who followed in Spiegelman's footsteps, in his second generation, The Things I Didn't Tell My Father, that pointedly describes how his father's trauma leaked into his existence. 2 years later, the Israeli artist Michal Kovner published Ezekiel's World, a graphic novel that narrates the traumatic chapter in his father's past during the Holocaust. So, Michal Kishka, whose father was a Holocaust survivor, was born in 1954 in Liège, Belgium. In 1974, he moved to Israel, where he became a famous cartoonist and a lecturer at the Bettine Art Academy and design in Jerusalem. Kishka's second generation, whose structure resembles a Greek tragedy, is divided into 5 chapters in a linear narrative that unfolds his growing up in Belgium and his adult life in Israel. His life is marked by and revolved around his father's history or story as a Holocaust survivor. And here, for many years, Michal's father kept his past to himself, which only increased his son's curiosity, as is seen, for instance, in the panel that depicts Michal is a child looking at the tattoo on his father's arm and wondering, my dad didn't talk much about his family, if at all. Who wrote that number on his arm? It, of course, appears also in Spiegel's mouth, if you remember. And then we see that he keeps on looking for more information because his father doesn't provide any, and he was looking for pictures. This is canonic or mythological, canonic, let's call it this way, a picture of the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, where his father was liberated, and he can't find him. So, and he goes on and telling about his story. He is, his father and his wife are having a family. They have 4 children. They have to support them, and they have a dress shop in Liège. And Michal writes.
Pnina,
Yes.
we can't see what are you talking about. We see the title slide.
You don't see the complete?
No, we see your computer, not the full screen show.
I don't know what to do. Maybe
No,
our assistant will our Wiz, the computer Wiz will assist me. It's written
Let's try and share screen again. Okay, so I'm
Okay.
stopping screen
No
sharing.
problem. Okay, no problem.
Okay.
Now? It's the same, but did you move to the next screen? שקופית, how you say, slide? Or you... No, you're still on the first one, right?
Well, I really don't know what to do. Maybe I don't know.
Are you showing now the second slide?
This is
or a different one?
Number 4 or 5. This is
no, so it
Okay.
doesn't work.
So
have you seen this one?
we see number 2, but I think
this is number 1.
Let me stop the screen sharing again. I think when you have the options, choose the one which is wider. So you have 2 PowerPoint options. Choose the one that is wider. That's the full screen.
Okay.
And you see 2 options of PowerPoint?
Only one.
Only one?
Yeah.
So I guess this is the same bug I had yesterday. Just use your presentation, but move the one you work on.
Okay, so make it so I will not enlarge it. I'll keep it, with the slide, and I will move the slides. Okay,
yes.
Thank you, Erga. But I don't see the slides now.
Oh, now it's okay. Yeah, we already saw the third one.
But I don't see the...
Here.
Is it okay?
Now we are at the third slide.
Third slide.
This is not enlarged.
That's fine, but we can see the slides.
Yes, but okay. I don't see here how can I move it? Well, okay.
Yes.
I'm just guessing because I don't see, I'm like a blind person who's trying to find the right place. Okay.
Nina, do you see the third slide now? The 4th? Now it's the 4th slide?
Second. This is the second.
Yes.
This is the third.
This is the third. And this is the 4th. Can I move on? Shall I move on?
Now it's the 4th slide. Okay, would you like to continue from here?
Yeah, I don't know when did you? Okay, let's start from here.
Okay.
Restart from here.
Okay.
Okay. Here's the number. Okay. So start from +5. Michal Kishka, whose father was a Holocaust survivor, was born in 1954 in Liège. In 1974, he moved to Israel. He studied and became a lecturer at the Bettine Art Academy of Art and Design in Jerusalem, and became a very famous cartoonist in Israel, as well as in other countries. He's the second generation, whose structure resembles a Greek tragedy, is divided into 5 chapters or acts in a linear narrative that unfolds the growing up in Belgium, his adult life in Israel. His life is marked by and revolved around his father's history as a Holocaust survivor. For many years, Michal's father kept his past to himself, which only increases his son's curiosity, as is seen, for instance, in the panel to the left, that depicts Michal as a child looking at the tattoo on his father's arm and wondering, my dad didn't talk much about his family, if at all. Who wrote that number on his arm? There is a similar image in Mouse, at the beginning of Mouse. And then, of course, we see that he's looking, later on, he's looking in other albums that his father has in his library, and he's looking for him to see maybe he can find any among the images the resemblance of his father, but he can't. Now you see?
Yes.
Okay. For many years, Michal's father, Henri, contented himself with raising a family and providing for them. Michal depicts his father in the family dress shop, confined in the shop storage from the storage room that leads to his tiny office, full of striped pajamas with a tag that read, weight 32 kilo, 1,150 days, and number 17713 times 789, which indicate his resumed biography and identity as a Holocaust prisoner. So he doesn't talk, but there are always references to his life as an inmate. The turning point happens with the tragic death of his elder son. And during the Shiva, his father he took his life by himself as a son, and he was found by his father. And the book turning point occurs in the 3rd chapter that narrates his brother Charlie's suicide, a traumatic event that unlocked his Holocaust trauma that transformed him from a victim of a Holocaust into a Holocaust hero. So we see in the background of the Malin wagon, which was used to be, and here's the museum, and I mean the casernes that turned out to be a museum, and all the emblems of the Holocaust, Cyclone B, Juif, etc., and Auschwitz. Okay. Henry Kishka, who published his memoir, shared his story with students at school and on trips to Auschwitz, attended conference and memorial days, and was awarded medals and honors and gained recognition as a Holocaust survivor. And this, as we see, happened when he was reached the age of 70. So actually, it follows a pattern that was written in Annette Vioka's book, The Era of the Witness. And Kishka describes the process undergone by his father from familiar secretive silence to becoming a public bearer of testimony. He, as I said, published his memoir, etc. And thus he becomes a worthy representative of the era of the witness who acquired a new social identity as a bearer of history. Quoted from Aviv Yorka. At the bottom of the panel that we see here, which displays 3 snapshots of Henri Kishka guided tour to Auschwitz, done in 2001, 2005, and 2009. Henri appears in his prisoner's cap, accompanied by Michal, both walking on a red carpet designated for VIP Auschwitz visitors. The text accompanying the image reads, "I know that he will be happy if I will join one of these groups, but as his son, I think I have the right to have a private visit. Only he and me, with no photographs, no lectures." Thus, the son doesn't need to learn about his father's past as a public figure, but as an intimate person, a situation which led to some estrangement between them. In an interview done in 2016, Kishka justifies reluctance. "I don't need to go there to realize what happened. I grew up with its ghost. I grew up in its shadow." So there is some kind of estrangement between Kishka and his father, but eventually, at the end of the graphic novel, there is a catharsis, there is a writing liberation, and the culminating image depicts the artist after finalizing his Odyssey. He is flying. His shadow is cast on one of the previous pages, in which his father lectures a group of school children at the gate of Auschwitz main camp, with its iconic motto, "Arbeit macht frei." The cynical motto is charged with an additional meaning. It refers to Kishka's own exhausting work on the confessional autobiographic memoir. Reaching the end of the painful and painstaking exposure, through which he tries to free himself from the shadow of his Holocaust legacy, the artist experiences a catharsis, and he writes, "I never felt so good," as we see. Thus, the confessional diary that enables him to liberate myself from all my questions and frustrations, as he said in an interview in 2015, follow the Aristotelian rule that tragedy should lead to a catharsis and a purifying act. So both to his father, to him, and eventually their reconciliation. So this is one. Okay. Michal Kovner was born in 1948 in Israel, in a kibbutz, which I'm not sure whether it's Ein HaChoresh or Mishmar HaChoresh, so I'll say just a kibbutz. During his early 20s, he studied in New York, the art, and he stayed there for several years, and he became an artist who did many cityscapes, both in New York. Later on, he returned to Jerusalem, and in Jerusalem, as well as landscapes and portraits. And he is what he calls himself, "I'm a realistic artist." His paintings are usually quite on big canvases. And his graphic novel, which he published in 1915, was his first approach to anything to do with graphic. I mean, it was novelty for him, and he wanted to tell, in a way, his father's story, and he wanted to do it as a graphic novel, and he didn't want to follow the traces of previous artists, like, for instance, what we've seen in Kishka's or in Spielmann's Mouse or other artists. So he pursued his artistic way. He did it. He painted everything on relatively big canvases, either oil paintings or acrylic, and then he transformed it with various computer devices into a completely different graphic novel. So, contrary to Kishka and most second-generation graphic novels, who try to excavate the parental past to reveal the familiar archaeological layers, the role of Kovner's father, Abba Kovner, who was born 1917, past 87, who was a renowned leader of the 1943 Vilnius Ghetto uprising, is interwoven in the history of the Holocaust. Michal, at the age of 16, attempted to create a posthumous dialogue with his father, who had passed away some 20 years earlier, a dialogue that Michal states was regrettably incomplete during our lives. Though Michal based his protagonist, Ezekiel, on his father, he didn't feel obliged to maintain historical accuracy, as can be seen from the opening page in which he introduced Ezekiel. And this is the image from the first page. Ezekiel is a lonely man. His wife died a few years earlier. Actually, his wife outlived him, Abba Kovner, in 25 years. She passed away only 2002, so this is not very accurate. And he writes, it goes on. Ezekiel was an important historical figure as a resistance commander in Second World War and a political leader. He was also a respected poet and writer. The story is actually set during 1991 Gulf War. Abba Kovner passed away in 1987, and it said Vitka, his wife, was still alive at the time of the narration. He is accurate when presenting Abba Kovner's public persona, a resistant commander, a respected poet and writer, yet imprecise in portraying his private identity as a father and a husband, as Michal explains. There is Abba Kovner of the historical documents, but I have an Abba Kovner of memories of thought and of feelings, and it is to those that I wanted to devote myself rather to the historical truth. So it's very interesting. Just like Kishka, who refrained from having a liaison with his father as a public figure. So we see both want the private person and not the public one. The story introduces us to the widower Ezekiel, who lives alone in Jerusalem. By the way, to the left we see, of course, Abba Kovner, and we see the physical resemblance, Ezekiel versus Abba Kovner. So the story introduces to the widower Ezekiel, who lives alone in Jerusalem, estranged from his family members. His daughter has committed suicide. His only son, Amos, who is more or less Michal, has left Israel, partly due to a rift between him and his father, and lives in San Francisco with his Israeli wife, Yvonne, and their 6-year-old son, Noni. With the outbreak of the Gulf War, Yvonne goes with Noni to Israel. Okay. The story main events are embedded in a French story that takes place during the Gulf War, during which the Israeli home front became a front, and the citizens equipped with mass gas were required to take refuge from missile barrels in rooms sealed with plastic sheeting. This period, which has been dubbed as the Holocaust in the sealed room, created an analogy between seclusion in sealed room and the Holocaust, thus many of Holocaust survivors whose past experience then suffered from acute traumas and anxiety, as seen in Ezekiel's story. As the story unfolds, Ezekiel, who suffers from chronic arthritis, falls while at home alone. Following a sequence of rhythmic and dynamic frames that captures the fall and the old man's vulnerability, the agonized and helpless Ezekiel lies on the floor and visualizes the tragic events that unfolded in the Vilnius ghetto on July 16, 1943, when the Germans demanded that the members of the resistance movement turn over their leader, Yitzhak Wittenberg, threatening that if they failed to do so, the 20,000 remaining Jews would be liquidated. The Nazi ultimatum steered the ghetto inmates, many of whom demanded that the resistance turn Wittenberg over. Eventually, Wittenberg turned himself in, but not before appointing Abba Kovner as his successor. So it's not only a story that happened during those critical days in the ghetto, but it has very relevant personal touch to the family Kovner. And this dilemma is portrayed here when some of the, I would say, more accusing words or unpolite or whatever it is are written in red, and they are in Yiddish and in handwritten. Now in this dimension, I don't think you will see it, but it's here. It's here, and it's very expressive, you know, contrary to the square and other graphic, well done images. So the nightmarish images that reflect the sequence of the events of this Machiavellian dilemma are accompanied by the handwritten text in Yiddish, rendered in red and translated into English and explained in the back of the book. The morning after the fall, Ezekiel's physical therapist comes to his home and brings a Lego set for him to play with his grandson. As Noni, the grandson, comes to visit him, Ezekiel thought of transmitting to Noni the legacy by constructing the ghetto uprising with Lego pieces. So we see here the first phase, we see the grandfather, we see Noni, everything is very well arranged, everything. The colors are more clear than we have seen previous in the nightmarish image. And they are constructing together with this, with a Lego. And it seems quite fine. While doing it, they reach the point of the failure of the resistant fighter uprising and the liquidation of the ghetto. And Ezekiel persists his oral testimony. And he says, rumors of our plan to escape through the ghetto sewers had spread out, and more people began gathering around the sewer entrance, demanding that we take them with us. Fighting broke out. I gave an order that we would not take anyone with us who had no weapon, including parents and siblings. It was the worst moment of my life. This requirement secluded Ezekiel's widowed mother, who was left behind in her inevitable tragic end. At this point, Noni asks difficult questions and leaves his grandfather agitated and speechless. Ezekiel, distressed and in despair, destroys the reconstruction ghetto, puts his hands on the table and cries, "Why don't you understand why? Why don't you run away? We didn't run away. We didn't run away." And then Noni cries and says, "Enough, Grandpa, enough." It is not clear whether the 6-year-old child means that he cannot hear anymore or that he wants to shield and comfort his distressed and suffering grandfather. It is purposely ambiguous. So we see here again the previous nightmarish images are evoked after this, let's say, organized reconstructing a joint venture of reconstructing, and he is exposing his distress. The final scenes, which depict Ezekiel's brutal deconstruction of the Lego ghetto, can be seen as Ezekiel's exorcism, trying to evict the demons of his past that keep on tormenting him for his decisions that he described as the worst moment of my life. When Noni and his mother coming to say goodbye to Ezekiel before the return to San Francisco, Ezekiel sees that his grandson had forgotten the Lego set. Noni is called back to retrieve it, and holding the Lego box in one hand and waving to Ezekiel with the other, he's asking Ezekiel, "Will I see you again, Grandpa?" After so many years that there was no connection between them. Only after the transmission of the legacy can the grandfather and the grandson bond properly with the Lego as a bridge.
פנינה, רק אם יורשה לי לאט,
אני גומרת.
בסדר, 100%.
אוקיי, I will not.
יש עוד 7 דקות, בסדר, אבל אני רק ככה. תודה.
בבקשה. Constructing the Vilnius ghetto uprising with Lego pieces not only connect Ezekiel and Noni, but also implies that Noni, who carries with him the Lego, as we have seen in the previous, let's go back. No. Who carries with him the Lego set and the legacy, will serve as an intermediary who will bridge the gap between Father Ezekiel and his strange son Amos. So it's not only between grandfather and his grandson, but actually Noni is also a bridge between father and the son, who were the divergence ideas made them quite strange. Being grounded in his personal familiar past, Michal constructs a very sophisticated multi-layered narrative. Not only does he present the intergenerational transmission as part of the protagonist's way of coming to terms with his strange son, but by basing the account on the accurate historical evidence, the author, who is also the survivor's son, blends the literary hero and the historical persona. By doing so, Michael Kovner helps his real father to be relieved posthumously of his unbearable pain and guilty conscience associated with the decisions that always haunted him. Thus, despite the different stories, both Kishka and Kovner try to come to terms with their father's past. I just want to say that I've heard many oral testimonies. I mean, those testimony, Abba Kovner lectured a lot, and it was recorded, and he talked about this crucial moment concerning his mother, and it was always very it was clear she asked him what to do, and he answered something that you can always understand it in two ways. It was always very ambiguous. So it shows that, and he was very versed in words. I mean, this was one of his forte. So it really, we see that Michal knew better than other people how shocked he was, how traumatized he was by this event. And I would like to finalize, with words written by Clarice Lispector, the Brazilian Jewish author. Art is not purity, it is purification. Art is not liberty, it is liberation. And I think both graphic novels had showed it each in its way. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Could you just stop share screen? Great. Okay. So thank you again for all these three wonderful papers, and we'll open the floor for discussion. I have few questions, but I will wait with them. Or maybe I will start and then you'll jump in. So I was curious, trying to follow a line through all these papers. I was thinking about second generation in a way, and in the case of Pnina, I'm not sure, I'm speaking about Yishai Sarid, okay, for a start. And so thinking about Etgar, Keret, Yishai Sarid, and let's say Michael Kovner, there is a question of the memory or the confrontation or dealing with the memory of the Holocaust with or by second generation authors, artists. And there was also the question of, back then, Chris' question actually, the institution and the institutional memory. So to my mind, it came that perhaps this whole issue of blurring the lines between victim and perpetrator, trying to deconstruct the dichotomy, the bounded dichotomy, has to do with an intention to reclaim the private memory. Like when thinking about Keret, and again, Kovner, or even Kishkend, and also Sarid, I was trying to think, how do they stand against national memory or national narrative, official national narrative, and trying to reclaim it back to their own, so to say, family, or in a way against the public. So I would be happy to hear what you have to say about it.
I'll start. I wanted to say that there is no any blurring of boundaries between perpetrator and victim, and no way. The issue is a rejection of the dichotomy itself of perpetrator and victimization if you want to reclaim your memory. All right, to reclaim the memory, to appropriate your memory back, you need to work out how you live without this dichotomy. But not blurring the borderlines. No,
okay, so deconstruction instead of blurring.
No, deconstruction.
Even not deconstruction, because then you need to.
This dichotomy is invalid for Keret. I'm talking about Keret and this line of thinking. So there is no valid dichotomy. This dichotomy is not the proper instrument for thinking about memory in second and third generation, actually. This is the situation in these terms, right? There is no boundaries here, to talk about, because there is no such a dichotomy in this anthropological philosophical way of thinking.
Model. Great, thank you. And maybe later, if you have some time to remark on the humor in Keret's offer. But Bettina.
Yes, well, the characteristic of the four novels that I discussed was that none of them has an autobiographical element. That is to say, Jessica Durlacher is the daughter of a survivor, but it's not his story that she tells in this novel. And so this tension between public and private memory is well, actually not present in these novels. And I like to stress again that the real perpetrators are not in these novels as a topic. So when there is a blurry lines, it's more about bystanders and helpers that are also perpetrators, for instance, or victims that are guilty of lack of understanding or lack of compassion and things like that, but not a strong dichotomy between perpetrator and victims that's absent in these novels.
And just in the case of Sarid, there is the whole debate about the journeys to Poland, which has also to do with the Ministry of Education and, by the way, also the role of Keret in this educational program, Sirens and Sfira. So it's somehow it bounds together, but of course it's very interesting to see, as you mentioned, the loose line of the, thank you.
And for me, these novels are interesting because they show something of the national outlook. So how do Dutch authors look at their history compared to Polish, etc. So there's this national comparative.
And the national you understand as kind of for me it's again the question of the institution. So what do we do with this national identity? Does it belong to the to the nation or to the individual, or somehow how would you like to think about it in your case studies or the novel you explored? So
Pnina says that there is a lot of self-criticism in Israeli literature, and she's right. But in Keret, for example, this is self-criticism, but not this is not the self-shaming of the victim. Right, that this self-criticism is towards this pair, of the victim and the perpetrator. Yes, and against this situation when we were building these luxury museums, of Holocaust. So this is the object of criticism, not the border between perpetrator and the victim. When Giorgio Agamben talks about a gray zone, he's not right. Yes, Primo Levi himself says that it's unethical to talk about the exchanging of roles between perpetrator and victim. That's not my thought. Levi himself says, all right, this is a misunderstanding here. But Israeli writers sometimes find their way towards, I think, toward the truth here.
Erga, did you like to, or sorry, Marina, I saw your hand. What, you're unmute. Or maybe Pnina, would you like to comment, and then we'll open it up.
Concerning who's talking now?
You.
Okay. So concerning the museums, or let's call them the memory institutions, as agents of the transmitting of memory. I can vouch for the graphic novels that, for instance, done by Anna Frank Museum. I think they were among the first one. And then, of course, there were the Holocaust, what it's called today, Museum of the Shoah in Paris. And after many years, not so many years later, the Auschwitz Museum also published four, at least till now, four graphic novels based, follow the same pattern with educational kit, etc., which are meant to be educational tools like the search and that we have seen during our conference in the first one before the previous one. So as far as I checked the publications, each one is concentrated with their own national heroes or protagonists, or except of the Dutch that show the two sides of the coin in the search and the family secrets. They were the only ones who showed both the Jews and both the Dutch, who were in their complicated role as neighbors, and the family is not, only saints and only the bad guys, etc., etc. So, but for instance, the Auschwitz Museum published one of the inmates who were imported inmates at the time or became imported later on, like a famous priest, etc. What I paid attention, especially, was the love story that I was always referred to it as Malat Simetbaum and her Polish lover, Edek, and their escape from Auschwitz. And once I read it, I see it's Edek's story and Mala is second protagonist. So, and she was Jewish Polish who lived in Belgium, deported, etc., etc. So the shift was on Emily. I said, well, it's okay, it's logic, because, so I think it's very interesting to see this as a whole concept. I don't know if Yad Vashem published any graphic novels, because graphic novels in Israel and comics are not. So, but many other institutions did publish, and it's very interesting to see what they publish and what the line they are trying, or what the concept beyond this, the publications. Of course, it always has to do with the national, but what person from the national myth or the national important victim or whatever it is they are putting on the stage, and who is in the backstage. Yeah.
Thank you. So we have your question here, Marina, Daniel, and Erga, okay?
Yeah, okay, I muted myself. So my question is actually to Roman, and I remember, this attitude of Keret towards official institutions of memory. We have seen it in Dutch. I think it was a Dutch author, Arne Grunberg, translating Mein Kampf, that I liked so much, and I think that Barbara was not so fond of. So, this, what is it? What do you think is the grounds for this rejection of memorization, official public memorization? So is it rooted in the idea that official memory doesn't is institutionalized. And in order to remember something, you have to make it your own. You have to reappropriate, exactly. Thank you. So yeah, you have to reappropriate this memory, and no matter in what form. You can be ironic toward the official one, you can undermine it, you can use different anthropological approaches to the life experiences of many versus the life experience of one. So what is the ground for that? Because as we see, that doesn't happen only in Israeli literature.
I started from this point. So it looks like a kind of progressive leftist agenda, but in fact it is not. It is conservative line of thinking, because it's a liberal, classical liberal thinking. Individualism, personalism, the right of a person above the right of a state. Yeah.
Or the right of person above the right of many.
Of collective, of collective identity, of any identities, national identity, partisan identity. No way. So this is the rebel of an individual, yeah, of a person. It is something very romantic about it, after all. So it looks very, very postmodern, but it is not. It is modernist and romantic, maybe neo-romantic. I think that the main root of this is the humanistic, the classical liberal humanistic thinking, which looks like maybe something postmodern today, but no, because it is over the postmodern development. Keret begins deep inside the postmodern line of writing and thinking, but he continues in the same way till today. So it's something very personal. And I think this is a personalistic thinking after all. Humanistic, personalistic, it's something very, it's very close to me, because also I come from, I was born in socialist country. So the rebellion against the state and against the power is something that I can recognize in such writing. So this is his, I think this is his line of thinking.
Do you see Foucault in it?
No, not something that is Foucault. No, it's not about this kind of power. Yeah, it is about, this much more classical, yeah, much more modernist, pre-Foucaultian, I think, because there is no the punishing in Edgar Keret. There is no guilt. I saw Sarah wrote about the guilt. There is no guilt in Keret. No guilt, no victimization. He doesn't want victims on any side, and doesn't want to, to shame any of these scene on this scene. Yeah. So he wants to live further. He wants to live, and he asks about the memory. How can I live with this memory? Yeah, you're asking about the appropriation, and he understands that with all these institutions, this is the question of Michal. Yeah, what institutions are not bad. Yeah, they are very essential, but they are the basis in which I can build my own rebellion. Without the background of the state and institution, there is no rebellion. There is no personal flight, yeah, and escape. Without escape room, there is no escape. And it was my conclusion. The two processes are essential here, yeah. you need this museum to go into it, and inside, in the middle of the museum, to make your move, okay? To make your move towards, to make your gesture and to touch your memory, to touch the sign, yeah, the untouchable sign. In order to touch the untouchable sign, you need this untouchable sign. And this untouchable sign is produced by institution. This is the thinking that is more dialectical and more complex than the simple dichotomy, all right?
That's okay. I won't say anything.
Yeah,
Daniel,
I mean, I have.
Daniel. Sorry. Where is Daniel?
You can see me. Thank you for these very thought-provoking presentations. And again, this session also went very nicely with the one before and has gotten me thinking about many ideas. My question is motivated by all the presentations, but relates to Pnina's. Michal Kovner's work is at least doubly provocative. First, for violating the Bildverbot, the notion that the Holocaust cannot be represented visually, which first Maus and Spiegelman brought into the graphic novel, and then is explored in many different ways, as you said, with the Lego and so on. And also because Michal is obviously the son of, if anything, the paradigmatic survivor. We were just talking now about institutions. The previous session, we were talking about the institutional, or the official role of the survivor. And if anything, Abu Kovner is the survivor in this country, in Israel. In his role, the picture that you presented is not just any picture, but him on the stand in the Eichmann trial, although of course he had nothing to do with Eichmann. And even during his testimony, the judges referred him back to the case at hand. When I think about the ways that Erga, Pnina, that Roman's presentation talking about the evolution, recent contributions to Holocaust literature, it very much goes in the face of what Abba Kovner wrote. He, I think we can say this privately here, it's not officially because it's always been denied, but he's the one who told you to think, this is not how one writes about the Shoah. He was the standard that became part of the establishment of sheep to the slaughter. That's a line that he wrote. It's not his own line, but it's a line that he wrote. And he established what Etgar Keret, what his son, and what also the authors that Erga mentioned are writing against, the Zionist, completely approved survivor who created a way of writing. To what extent is that what Michal is doing, what Michal Kovner is doing explicitly? To what extent is he trying to violate or to trespass over these standards is a general question, and the idea of even his name, Abba Kovner, that was his name, but the patriarchal version of that's what Abba means father, the patriarchal version of a survivor that is the template against which these contemporary or more recent writers are experimenting is my general question for Pnina or for everyone more generally.
Okay. First of all, I would like to I try to show that Michal Kovner is doing against all odds, because in all the graphic novels from Maus on, the son tries to find out what happened because there is silence. And Michal doesn't have to look for anything because everything is documented, etc., etc., etc. So he finds I would say, the talon d'Achille, this weakest link, I mean, this crucial moment, and he embedded it in a very critical situation, which happened after his father's life, actually, in the Gulf War, as I tried to show, which really there was a very interesting research done by two scholars. One was both are psychologists, and they checked the number of old age people, relatively old age people, and the traumatic response to this, to the sealed room, and the number of Holocaust survivors who reacted badly was much higher than non-Holocaust survivors at the same age, in the same conditions. So I think showing this, how this survivor, this traumatic event, the dilemma with Wittenberg, etc., and later on with his mother, as it happened during this stress time, I think it's a very interesting and artistic and historically interesting melange of things in which he really enabled what he thought haunted his father all over his life. And it is true that there was a rift between them, a political rift, which I'm not going to elaborate on it. And for many years, they were quite estranged. Who did the bond later on? I think each one tried to reach the other. But the way he does it with this grandchild who is going to transmit to his Amos, who is more or less Michal, very more or less, less than more, I think is doing it very intelligently and very interestingly. And he really, if you see the series of images that he depicted, you feel the difference once he is remembering by himself, when he's alone, helpless person in his Jerusalem house, and when he's with his grandson. It starts so organized well and with clear colors, and then only his tormented soul brings it back to the previous one. So I think it's very nice, very well done graphically and thematically. I had to defending Kovner's very interesting graphic novel.
Thank you. We had another question. Erga, you wanted to...
Yes, please. I have two questions, one for Bettine and the second for Pnina. And that's not that I didn't like Roman's paper, but I have no question for him. Bettine, I like your reading of Emunah Elon's novel, but as Israeli read the book, I felt that the Ashkenazi Mizrahi question is something that changed Yoel Bloom into Yoel Russo, because he starts as Ashkenazi who pray Ashkenazi's tefillot, and he ends the novel when he's at the Mizrahi synagogue, Sephardic synagogue, praying the Sephardic version of the praise. So, and also his grandson, the only one who recognized him as a motorcycle with his new old vest. So I think it changed a lot, and the you saw his change different than when I read this novel. So I want to hear what do you think about it, if you have noticed this change. And the other question is for Pnina. Daniel asked you something that is connected to my question. The Lego scene, as you know, is a real scene because Kovner, the son, Michal, built built something in Lego bricks with his own son Abba Kovner's grandson. Then he took the pictures of their creation. And what do you think about the making of his book? As you know, Michel Kishka's book was oriented towards the French readers, but Kovner's book was oriented towards Israeli and English readers, and it was a private production, which he documented through time, and the Lego scene is very important. So what do you think about it? But my first question was, of course, for Bettine.
Yeah, well, I must confess that the differences between Sephardic and Ashkenazi Judaism escaped me. In one of the last scenes, Yoel is called to read the Torah, and he is called, and that's the doing of his grandson, by his real name. So he's called as Sebastian, son of Martin. So and that was moving, but as for the ritual and the words that were used in the prayer, that I didn't catch that. You can ask me everything about all the varieties of Protestantism in the Netherlands, but the varieties of Judaism are more difficult for me. So yeah, but what in this one of his final conversations with his grandson, the reproach that he makes towards Sonia, his mother, or that his grandson does, I forgot, is that she deprived him of his of the possibility to connect with his real ancestors, with his real descent, and his father and mother. And that is something that's not, there is no solution for. That's not resolved in any way, I think, in this novel. So she saved his life, more or less unwillingly, you could say. But she, by her post-war behavior, she deprived him of something essential, something of his past.
That's true, but at the end, he succeeded to connect to his grandson, to whom he wasn't connected for a few years. Oh, yes, so there is a success after all.
Yes, and he promises himself to try to connect again to his daughters, which he more or less has lost contact with. So, yeah, true.
And that is another question of Judaism, because this daughter is a single mother who left, who is not a practitioner. I don't know how to say. She doesn't believe anymore.
Mm-hmm. She's not a practitioner. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks.
So maybe your second question to Pnina?
Yes.
Pnina, would you like to answer? And then we...
Yes, no. I would like to answer,
please,
Erga, if I may. Okay, so if you remember the book, and there is when this Lego story starts, there is a reproduction of an album photograph from their childhood when he plays, when real Abba plays with real Mordechai, Michal. It was not Lego at the time, it was Avnei Pele, and they constructed something. And he recalls that it was, they were very happy when they did it together. It was a very, we didn't have those, all the nice things in Lego, but Avnei Pele was very basic, but it was nevertheless, and it was only architectural. It was, there were no figures in the Avnei Pele. However, and then later on, when he replace it with his grandson, the actual working together, it's not only that he is from one side, they are together, and there is this tactical feeling of touching each other. They didn't know each other because his son was estranged, and so was his grandson. He didn't see him. If it actually he sees him for the first time when he's 6 years old, when he comes to visit him in Jerusalem. So this, this sensoric and sensual connection between those estranged grandson and grandfather is very nicely shown. First of all, you have the maquette, you have the model, and then you have images of both persons. So you have also the proportion as you make a architectural maquette of a building or whatever, and you put people, you have the proportion. So it brings it back to the proportion, but then it really connects them. I mean, physically connects them. And it would have been probably possible in other way, but playing together, I mean, playing is something with rules. You can't break the rules when you are playing, but he breaks the rules when he deconstructs what he's doing. So the whole thing of playing and being a playmate and doing things, creating things together, I think it creates a better bond between those people who have a joint venture, actually, joint mission, a joint idea. And it goes back to the...
But there is a difference.
Yeah.
But there is a difference between an architectural building and demonstration of a camp. They build something like a camp.
No, I said only the figures. When you see the image of Noni with the model of the camp, you have you know how big it is or small it is, because this is scale model. And I just have to say, just as an example, when you build a skyscraper and you pick, I mean a maquette, and you put people there.
Nina, may I rephrase my question?
Please do.
The father and son, or the son and grandson,
are
building together a camp.
Yes.
A concentration or death camp. Is
No,
it a proper play for children? That is my question. Of course, yes. It's bonding.
I mean, yes, it is, because he tells him the story. He's telling this. I mean, this is a three-dimensional narration. It's not only oral, but let's do it. Let's make it. And while making, he maybe hopes that he will better understand, because he explains each role of the figures. Those are the good ones, the bad ones, and also there is a gray zone one, because he explains that the Jew who had to collaborate, like the Judenrat, had no other choice, and they were actually victims. So he makes a very complicated story. He visualizes and brings to life a very complicated story and situation, because all the dilemmas are complicated, and the Judenrat dilemma is complicated. And who shall we choose is complicated to say the least. So once you're doing it, and the son, Noni, doesn't know anything, so that he's a trigger of question when they are building. But logical in our normative life. And it shows how it was everything but normal. I mean, you couldn't measure it with your normative pre or after war concepts. And that's because he's innocent. He's not innocent because he's innocent. He isn't because he's ignorant. Noni, he doesn't know. So, and he brings his knowledge. And the knowledge is intriguing because it doesn't make sense. That it doesn't make sense.
Is there a parallel with the...
just a quick and then we close. Yes, the Pnina and...
is there a parallel between the video game in the Memory Monster?
That's what I was thinking about.
Okay. And
right, lots of parallels. Yeah. Okay, thank you so much for this fascinating lectures and discussion, and we'll meet again at 6:30. Bye, thank you.
תודה, מיכל.
תודה לכם.